Imagine a point on the map, so small it barely appears on nautical charts, and yet so valuable that emperors trembled at the sound of its name. A barren, scorching piece of land, nearly without fresh water, suspended between the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean. Its name was Hormuz. In the 17th century, whoever controlled Hormuz controlled the world. That was no exaggeration. It was the mathematics of power. Through those narrow waters flowed the silks of Persia, the spices of the Indies, the pearls of the Gulf, the gold of Arabia. It was the artery of global trade, the point of convergence between East and West, between Asian wealth and Europe's hunger for it. And Portugal held it in its hands. Since 1515, when Afonso de Albuquerque planted the Portuguese flag there, Hormuz had been the crown jewel of Lisbon's Eastern Empire, a near-impregnable fortress, built on the tip of an island, surrounded by sea on all sides, guarded by cannons and by a garrison that knew very well what it was protecting. For more than a century, no enemy had managed to tear it from Portugal's grasp, until 1622. In those early years of the 17th century, England lived with an uncomfortable contradiction. It wanted the East. It needed the East. The East India Company had been founded in 1600 with a clear mission: to break the Iberian monopoly over Asian trade and open new paths to wealth. But there was an enormous obstacle in the way, an obstacle called the Iberian Union. Since 1580, Portugal and Spain had been united under the same crown. To attack Portugal was, in theory, to provoke the greatest military power in Europe. It meant seeking war with Madrid, with all its fleets and all its armies. It was a risk no English monarch was willing to assume openly. And yet, there was an elegant way out, a solution that required no declaration of war, no direct confrontation with Spain, but that would produce exactly the same result. The English looked east, toward the vast empire of the Persian Safavids, and they saw a perfect ally. Shah Abbas the Great governed Persia with an iron hand and the vision of a statesman. He wanted Hormuz back. To him, that fortress was an open wound, a piece of his own coastline under foreign rule, a humiliation that had lasted more than 100 years. He had the army. He had the determination, but he did not have a navy. The English had exactly what he needed. The deal was struck. The East India Company would provide warships, naval cannons, and logistical support. In return, it would receive half of the war spoils and, more importantly, trading privileges within Persian territory. It was a pact of mutual convenience, cold as the steel of the swords that would soon be drawn. London knew what it was doing. By keeping the Persians on the front line, it maintained a layer of diplomatic deniability. Officially, this was a dispute between Persia and Portugal, but beneath that facade, England was deliberately dismantling the Portuguese Eastern Empire, brick by brick. The fortress of Hormuz was a work of military engineering that inspired equal measures of respect and fear. Its stone walls were thick enough to absorb cannon fire. Its elevated positions dominated the surrounding sea, and the island on which it was built created a natural moat that made any land assault extremely difficult. For more than a century, that architecture had been enough. But the world was changing. The Persians of Abbas the Great were no longer the medieval horsemen the Portuguese had faced decades before. The Shah had modernized his army with heavy artillery, trained military engineers, and siege tactics learned from both the Ottomans and the Europeans themselves. It was a 17th century army, not a 15th century one, and the English brought something the fortress simply could not ignore: warships. The combination was devastating in its logic. The Persians would apply constant pressure by land, cutting off any supply route, pinning the defenders inside the walls, consuming their reserves of food and ammunition. Meanwhile, the English squadron would dominate the sea around the island, intercepting any Portuguese reinforcements, blocking any attempted evacuation. Hormuz, built to be protected by the sea, watched the sea become its prison. The Portuguese garrison inside those walls was relatively small, sufficient to repel a direct assault, insufficient to withstand a prolonged siege on two simultaneous fronts. It was a cruel equation, and the Portuguese knew how to do that arithmetic. In January of 1622, the net began to close. Persian forces marched toward the coast, establishing positions around the Portuguese structures on the mainland, cutting the land routes that supplied the island. The threats were real and immediate. The Portuguese scattered across the region had to fall back, concentrate their forces, and defend themselves with whatever resources they had left. And the English ships of the East India Company took position in the strait. The fighting was fierce. The Portuguese inside the fortress of Hormuz resisted with the tenacity of men who knew they were defending a century of history. Cannons thundered on both sides. The Persians advanced, were repelled, and advanced again. With each passing day, however, the defenders' resources dwindled. No reinforcements were coming from Lisbon. The Iberian Union was entangled in conflicts across Europe. Madrid's attention was turned toward other fronts, and the distance between Portugal and the Persian Gulf was simply too vast for a rapid response. The fortress was alone. For months, the Portuguese garrison sustained the impossible, but the siege was doing its silent and inexorable work. Provisions ran out. Ammunition grew scarce. The men fell sick, and the sea all around, which had always been their protection, was now a barrier that imprisoned them rather than defended them. In April of 1622, Hormuz fell. The fortress that had stood for more than a century, the most powerful symbol of Portuguese dominion over the Persian Gulf, was surrendered. The Portuguese flag came down from those walls for the last time. It was the end of an era. The fall of Hormuz echoed across the known world. For Persia, it was a victory of historic proportions. Abbas the Great had recovered control over his own coastline, expelled the European invader that had been entrenched there for more than 100 years, and reaffirmed Safavid power as the dominant force in the region. The Shah celebrated. He had every reason to. For England, the victory was perhaps even more significant than it appeared at first glance. The East India Company had proven it could challenge Portugal at the very heart of its Eastern Empire. The commercial privileges obtained from Persia opened doors that had previously been closed. It was the beginning of something far greater. It was the signal that the Indian Ocean would not belong to the Iberians forever. For Portugal, the defeat was a wound that never fully healed. Hormuz was not an accident. It was the symptom of something deep and irreversible. The Portuguese Empire in the East was becoming too large to defend with the available resources. There were too many fortresses, too much coastline, too many enemies, and fewer ships, soldiers, and funds to keep everything functioning. The Iberian Union, which in theory should have strengthened Portugal, had in practice scrambled its priorities, drained its resources, and made the Portuguese crown subservient to Madrid's European wars. The loss of Hormuz was the first great signal that Portuguese dominion over Eastern trade was living on borrowed time. It would not come all at once. It would come in pieces, in fortresses lost one by one, in abandoned routes, in monopolies that ceased to exist. The balance of power in the world had shifted, and this time there was no going back. The fall of Hormuz in 1622 was not merely the loss of a fortress. It was the collapse of an idea, the idea that a small kingdom on the edge of Europe could, forever, hold alone the reins of global trade. Portugal had built something extraordinary. In less than 100 years, navigators from a small country had mapped the world, planted flags on 3 continents, and created the first truly global empire in human history. Hormuz was the cornerstone of all of that in the East. But history does not wait. Other empires rise, while others fall asleep upon their own conquests. The Safavid Persians knew the value of what they had reclaimed, and England had learned a lesson it would take seriously for centuries to come. That real power did not lie in having more gold than the enemy, but in controlling the roads through which gold flows. Hormuz was the beginning of the great redistribution of power in the East. 1622, the year Persia and England crushed Portugal, erased a century of Iberian dominion over the Persian Gulf, and changed the destiny of the world.